Last time we spoke about a major Chinese counteroffensive at Shanghai. Black Saturday saw over 1,000 civilians killed. In response, Chiang Kai-shek launched Operation Iron Fist on August 17th, aiming to exploit weaknesses in the Japanese defenses, but failed due to disarray and entrenched opposition. Amidst mounting pressure, Chinese commanders redirected their strategy towards Yangshupu, seeking to breach Japanese lines along the Hangpu River. The 36th Infantry Division, newly trained by German advisors, launched a surprise assault on August 19th, but inexperienced troops faced relentless Japanese fire, struggling to hold their positions. As casualties mounted, the Japanese executed strategic landings at Chuanchakou and Wusong, capturing key points with minimal resistance. The battle at Baoan became emblematic of their resistance, where a handful of defenders vowed to fight to the last man, encapsulating the desperation and bravery of those battling under the shadow of impending defeat. This episode is The Battle for Shanghai Part 4, The Battle for Luodian. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on my YouTube channel, I just released an episode looking at how Japanese anime depicts or doesn't depict the Pacific War. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In the early days of September, a profound sense of resignation descended upon the senior Chinese commanders as the Japanese troops captured stronghold after stronghold along the riverbank, first at Shizuling, then Wusong, and finally Baoan. Despite the resignation amongst their leaders, the rank and file remained resolute in their determination to defend every inch of Chinese soil. The fighting along the Wusong Creek, extending west from Wusong, became particularly brutal. There were huge numbers of deaths on both sides, and the water of the creek turned red, wrote one Chinese official named Wang Juxi. He also added this in his diary: "The saying about rivers of blood became a grim reality." Meanwhile, the Japanese were landing more reinforcements, such as the Tita detachment on September the 6th. The next day, Tokyo HQ authorized the dispatch of the 9th, 13th, and 101st Divisions, as well as the Shigeto detachment to Shanghai. That same day, over 10 Japanese infantry battalions were ordered to advance from northeastern China to Shanghai. The situation was dire for the Chinese. Not only were their frontline units struggling in battle, but they were also sustaining exceptionally high casualties. By early September, Yao Ziqing's 98th Infantry Division had suffered nearly 5,000 casualties, including a regimental commander killed and another wounded. Throughout the battle for Shanghai, various units within the division received reinforcements up to 4 times. Upon arrival, these reinforcements were quickly armed and sent directly to the front lines. As recalled by Fang Jing, some were injured almost immediately after arriving. When they reached the hospital, they had no idea which unit they even belonged to. The string of defeats and setbacks significantly affected morale within the Chinese army, particularly amongst senior officers. While the lower ranks generally showed a willingness to continue the fight, high-ranking officials exhibited waning resolve. "All my soldiers have been sacrificed. There's nobody left." Xia Zhuozhang, the commander of the 79th Division, lamented in a phone call to Luo Zhuoying, head of the 18th Army, part of the 15th Army Group. In response, Luo Zhuoying urged, "Aren't you still standing? Hold your ground and fight." Having lost Baoan, the next defensive position was the small town of Luodian, the transportation center connecting Baoan, downtown Shanghai, Jiaoding, Songjiang, and several other towns via the highways. The successful defense of Luodian was crucial for the security of Suzhou and Shanghai. On August 29th, the German advisor Alexander von Falkenhausen warned Chiang Kai-shek that the town needed to be held at all costs, describing it as such. "It is the most crucial strategic point." Chiang Kai-shek was determined to hold on to Luodian. He personally summoned senior commanders to the 3rd War Zone headquarters in Suzhou, emphasizing that the town must be retaken at all costs. In response, the commanders deployed entire divisions to the Battle of Luodian. During one of the several Chinese assaults, Chu Weida, a regimental commander in the 51st Infantry Division, led a night attack on the southern part of Luodian. Moving quietly through the darkness, the Chinese force, about 2 companies strong, approached a Japanese camp, most of whose soldiers were still asleep. The Chinese launched a swift attack, giving the Japanese no chance to react. They shot and bayoneted soldiers while they were still lying down, successfully taking over the camp and preparing for a counterattack. When the Japanese responded, the Chinese staged a fighting retreat, deliberately luring the enemy into an open area where the well-armed soldiers lay in ambush. As the Japanese advanced, Chu Weida signaled with a flare, a prearranged signal to open fire. Infantry weapons of various calibers joined in the assault. As dawn broke, Chu Weida raised his binoculars to survey the scene, which was a disturbing sight, covered with a tangled mass of dead and dying bodies. The Japanese commanders launched what they hoped would be the decisive blow to break out from Baoshan's perimeter. Elements of the 3rd Division were tasked with moving down the road towards Luohang, and then they were going to occupy Yanghang. Meanwhile, the 11th Division's Amaya detachment, which had just arrived in Wusong on September the 2nd, was to seize Yupu, a village on the other strategic road leading west from Baoshan that blocked access to Luodian and the opportunity to link up with other units of the 11th Division still fighting in the area. This operation aimed to create the necessary space for a full assault upon Shanghai, and the Japanese dedicated every available resource to the effort. The artillery barrage began before dawn on September the 1st, with the Japanese guns of all calibers participating. For more than 2 weeks, the Japanese had been able to disembark supplies at landing sites along the Yangtze and Hangpu rivers. After daybreak, air raids intensified unusually, with the Japanese seemingly deploying all available aircraft in this narrow part of the front. Eventually, the Japanese infantry prepared to launch their attack. While this was simply the latest in a series of Japanese assaults, the sheer tenacity displayed indicated to the Chinese that this time it was different. However, after an entire day of fighting, little territorial gain was made. The defenders fought with a determination bordering on fanaticism, despite a total lack of air and artillery support, effectively utilizing the obstacles created by canals that cut through the heavily cultivated area. By sunset, the Japanese had advanced no further than the eastern edge of Yupu, although the village had been completely destroyed by artillery fire. Yanghang remained firmly in Chinese hands. In the countryside between the 2 western roads leading from Baoshan, Japanese units had only managed to occupy territory where their artillery and aircraft had utterly obliterated the defenders. To an outsider, it might seem that the Chinese could breathe a sigh of relief. However, from the perspective of Chinese commanders, the situation was very different. Their primary concern was the Japanese superiority in artillery. The contested area north of Shanghai consisted mainly of low-lying rice and cotton fields, with relatively few trees, offering insufficient camouflage for all but the smallest units. This allowed Japanese naval gunners on the elevated waters of the Yangtze and the Hangpu to sometimes directly observe Chinese troops. Even when there was no direct line of sight from the ships in the rivers, they were aided by the directions of observers patrolling in aircraft or hovering in balloons over the horizon. The Chinese had long realized that exposing their units to continuous attack from naval guns played directly into the Japanese hands. They understood that they needed to move away from the riverbank and the lethal fire of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Although the decision to withdraw would have been made sooner or later, it was hastened by the relentless Japanese pressure on the 2 roads from Baoshan, as their loss would create a breach between Zhang Zhijiang's 9th Army Group in the Shanghai area and Chen Cheng's 15th Army Group to the left. General Gu Jietang, a member of Chiang Kai-shek's inner circle who had recently been appointed deputy commander of the 3rd War Zone, witnessed how some of the best units were being decimated in the defense of Yupu and Yanghang. Meanwhile, Zhang Zhijiang was pushing for the withdrawal of troops in Yangshipu, which risked becoming a dangerously exposed salient if the breach occurred. The order for the 2 Chinese army groups to withdraw came late on September the 11th. Under the cover of darkness, the bulk of the divisions pulled back to positions reinforced by reserves in the preceding days. As thousands of soldiers moved several miles to the rear, the Japanese remained unaware that anything unusual was occurring, and the entire movement took place without enemy harassment. Only skeleton crews remained in the original Chinese positions. By the morning of September the 12th, the new front line stretched from the North Railway Station to the eastern edge of Zhongwan, bent west of Shanghai and Luodian, and extended north to the banks of Yangtze. Unbeknownst to them, the Japanese had become masters of heavily contested areas from Yangshupu to the south and Yupu to the north. The Chinese military leadership attempted to explain to the public that it had no choice but to withdraw, and had never seriously expected to be able to push the Japanese back into the Yangtze, given the hundreds of naval guns at their disposal. A military spokesman would say, "The objective of the Chinese command was to delay and harass the landing. It was never hoped that we would permanently repel the landing." The Chinese expressed confidence in their new positions, even comparing them to the Maginot Line along the French border with Germany, which of course would become rather ironic. The Japanese now controlled the entire left bank of the Hongpu River from Yangshupu to the mouth of the Yangtze. They had access to several good roads, some interconnected, which could serve as supply lines for future attacks. Additionally, they could exploit a large number of modern Chinese wharfs and docks, setting the stage for a steady flow of reinforcements. On the 12th, Matsui received word from the Amaya detachment that it had finally captured Yupu. After driving the Chinese out of the village, the detachment established a defensive perimeter in a semicircle 500 yards around the western edge. Nearly simultaneously, the Inuit detachment, a unit attached to the 3rd Division, reported that it had occupied Yanghang and pursued the enemy to a position about 2 miles west of the village. In both cases, it appeared that the enemy had abandoned their positions under the cover of night. Yet despite the victories, Matsui desperately needed more men. In the 3 weeks leading up to September the 11th, the Japanese had managed to land over 40,000 soldiers, and they established a bridgehead measuring roughly 25 miles in length and over 5 miles in depth. Together with the troops already present in Shanghai, Japan had about 50,000 soldiers. While this was a significant force, it was still insufficient to ensure the conquest of Shanghai, especially given the rapid attritional warfare. As of September the 9th, the 3rd Division had reported losses of about 589 killed and 1,539 injured, while the 11th Division recorded 616 dead and over 1,336 wounded. But Tokyo was very reluctant to dispatch troops to Shanghai. From the viewpoint of the Imperial Japanese Army leadership, Shanghai and central China were a sideshow to the North China Theater, which they, alongside the Kwangtung Army, argued was much more essential, given the proximity of the USSR. This belief was strongly reinforced when the Sino-Soviet agreement was signed in late August. Shanghai also heavily favored the Chinese terrain-wise. It was basically like the Battle of Thermopylae. Instead of a mountain pass, it was an extremely concentrated urban area. Then there was one of the main advocates opposing the China War altogether, that being Kanji Ishiwara. The entire time he was screaming and lecturing non-expansion, and advised diplomacy, and even to form an alliance with China against the USSR. Concentrating on China ignoring the Soviet menace was, in his eyes, like, quote, chasing the dogs away from the front door while forgetting the wolves approaching the back door. However, Ishiwara's reluctance to send more troops to Shanghai was overruled, of course. On September the 4th, a meeting of officers in Tokyo concluded that the Battle of Shanghai should be completed by late October, if not early November, and to that end, sufficient troops needed to be deployed. 3 days later, Emperor Hirohito approved reinforcements for the Shanghai front, including the dispatch of 3 additional infantry divisions from the home islands, along with units from the garrison forces in Taiwan. Ishiwara was very upset by this decision, and he submitted his resignation, although he would later be appointed to a position in the army in northeastern China. There was little doubt amongst the Japanese leaders that the deployment of these reinforcements marked a significant escalation in the war. The situation was unlike anything Japan had ever experienced before. Army Minister Sugiyama Hajime remarked in a statement to his commanders, "This war has become a total war." A junior Japanese officer inspecting the Shanghai front reported upon his return to Tokyo, "The enemy resistance is undeniably strong. Whether they are bombed out or surrounded, they do not retreat." Luodian had remained under Japanese control since late August, but the surrounding countryside largely remained under Chinese control. Despite increasing pressure after the Chinese withdrawal to the south on September the 12th, the Japanese advanced only slowly and hesitantly. Taken aback by the sudden gains at Yupu and Yanghang, and revealing their typical tardiness in responding to unforeseen events, it took them several days to even dispatch patrols for probing attacks against the new Chinese defenses. This delay provided the Chinese commanders with extra time to reinforce their positions near Luodian, particularly on both sides of the road from Yupu, which they correctly assumed would be the primary route for the Japanese attackers. Chinese preparations were just one reason Japan's mid-September assault was only moderately successful. Like the Chinese, the Japanese had yet to develop much skill in coordinating infantry and armor operations. The road connecting Yupu and Luodian was of relatively good quality, enabling the Japanese to deploy about 25 tanks as the spearhead of their thrust. These armored vehicles quickly eliminated the Chinese positions closest to the road and advanced rapidly towards Luodian. However, the accompanying infantry from the Yamaya detachment was unable to keep pace. The Japanese only held a few yards of terrain on either side of the road. Beyond that narrow strip, the area was swarming with Chinese soldiers, making the advancing Japanese infantry easy targets. The Japanese infantry became bogged down, and it was only after dark when the Chinese defenders north of the road chose to withdraw westward that the Japanese would have a chance to reach Luodian. The debacle on the road to Luodian was not solely a result of flawed training within the Japanese ranks. The area around Shanghai, a patchwork of small farm plots divided by creeks and canals, was ill-suited for tank warfare. This terrain had previously been a key argument against large-scale deployments by the Japanese army. Nevertheless, once the decision was made in Tokyo to send enough troops to win the battle for the city, the generals had to strategize ways to overcome these terrain challenges. One proposed solution was to deploy amphibious tanks. However, the tactics employed calling for the use of tanks in a supportive role rather than leading the attacks across waterways. If a creek needed to be crossed, Japanese commanders would first order a small infantry unit to wade or swim to the opposite bank and prepare it for tanks to land under the cover of darkness. While it was still dark, the tanks would cross and provide support to the infantry by daybreak. This cumbersome procedure often felt like putting the cart before the horse, but the Japanese executed it precisely as prescribed, time and time again. This predictability allowed their Chinese opponents to acclimate to Japanese tactics, to such an extent that they could usually anticipate what the Japanese would do next. While flawed tactics prevented either side from breaking the stalemate at the Luodian front, both continued to pour reinforcements in. The Shigeto detachment arrived from Taiwan and was attached to the 11th Division on September the 14th, the same day that the Yamaya detachment made its way up the road from Yupu to return to the division's direct command. By mid-September, the division had grown into a sizable fighting force. However, the enemy it faced around Luodian was also growing stronger by the day, posing a significant threat to the division's right flank if it were to rush south towards Dachang to link up with the 3rd Division. Therefore, on September the 18th, the Shanghai commanders ordered the division to focus initially on eliminating the Chinese troops amassed around Luodian. By this time, heavy rain had already fallen in the Shanghai region for over 3 days, gradually slowing the fighting. The Japanese disliked the rain, as it turned the roads into muddy rivers, making transportation difficult if not impossible, while also grounding most of their aircraft. In stark contrast, the Chinese welcomed the lull, as it provided them with an opportunity to improve their positions. The challenge of breaking through the Chinese defenses was only becoming much more difficult as time passed. The Chinese army's performance during the initial stage of the fighting in Shanghai altered the world's perception of the nation's military capabilities. China, which had lost every war over the past century, invariably to nations much smaller than itself, had suddenly taken a stand. At Shanghai, the Chinese army experienced more intense fighting than anyone could have anticipated, suffering losses that had taken years to build up. However, it had gained prestige and respect, even amongst its Japanese adversaries. Even the withdrawal of September the 12th was met with sympathy and admiration in capitals around the world. Every journalist in Shanghai during the fall of 1937 had a story to tell about the remarkable Chinese soldier. American journalist Carol Alcott spent many hours in dugouts in Jiaibei. While Japanese shells pelted down over their heads, the Chinese soldiers sat unfazed in their self-made caves, cooking rice, vegetables, and occasionally a small bit of pork over a charcoal brazier. They dispelled the inevitable boredom with games of checkers and mahjong, and wrote letters home to their families. In the Chinese trenches, there was a sense of safety and primitive kind of comfort. Chiang Kai-shek had decided as early as September the 15th that changes were needed at the top of their command in the Third War Zone. What this meant became clear 6 days later when Chiang Kai-shek sent 2 separate cables to the zone's senior commanders. In the first cable, he announced that he would take over command of the 3rd War Zone from Feng Yusang and dispatched him to the 6th War Zone further north. This was a sideways move rather than a direct demotion, but it undeniably removed Feng Yusang from the most crucial theater at the time. Despite this, the decision seemed logical to most senior officers in Suzhou. Feng Yusang had never effectively managed the 3rd War Zone during his time in command. None of his direct subordinates truly considered him to be in charge. Instead, they continued to view Chiang Kai-shek as their actual commander. In his second cable of the day, Chiang Kai-shek went a step further by relieving Zhang Zhuzhang of his duties as commander of the 9th Army Group. He replaced him with General Zhu Xiaoliang, a staunch ally, and if possible, an even more vehement opponent of communism than himself. For Zhang Zhuzhang, the decision was no major surprise, as he had faced Chiang Kai-shek's constant reproaches since the early days of the battle. Although Chiang Kai-shek initially selected Zhang Zhuzhang due to his close connections with the divisional commanders he led, he grew increasingly disenchanted with Zhang's style of command, characterized by, quote, much talk and little action. And he expressed his irritation both publicly and privately. There had been an additional reason for this. Disagreements amongst the top echelons of the 3rd War Zone threatened to bring about paralysis. Zhang Zhuzhang had not gotten along well with Chen Chang, the commander of the neighboring 11th Army Group. Zhang had told anyone who would listen, Chen Chang isn't capable enough. To which Chen retorted, Zhang Zhuzhang loves to show off. The strain that Shanghai was under also had an economic aspect. Although it had been a bumper year for both rice and cotton, the 2 most popular crops in the area, and many farmers were unable to harvest due to the continued heavy fighting around the city. Labor disputes simmered and occasionally erupted into the open conflict. On September the 14th, a group of workers hired on short-term contracts by the Fuhuang flour mill in the western part of the international settlement locked themselves inside and refused to leave until their demands for 10 months' salary were met. Police and members of the reserve unit, a special anti-riot outfit, attacked the premises with tear gas and managed to disperse the protesters. Subsequently, ambulances transported 25 injured individuals to various hospitals from the mill. As if the city was not already suffering hardship enough, a cholera epidemic broke out, taking a particularly heavy toll on the poorest inhabitants. As of September the 13th, the outbreak had lasted for over a month, with 119 confirmed cases and 9 deaths. Less than a fortnight later, it had infected 646 people and resulted in nearly 100 deaths. By early October, when the outbreak peaked, it had claimed a total of 355 lives. These statistics marked only the tip of the iceberg, as they accounted only for patients at hospitals in the international settlement, excluding the likely much larger numbers in the Chinese part of the city. In a way, these individuals were collateral damage. A doctor who had worked with the patient stated that a high degree of certainty that the disease had likely been brought to Shanghai by troops from the south. There existed a large villa overlooking Luodian that the Japanese termed the White House. The Chinese forces had held the White House for over 4 weeks, demonstrating fierce resistance. Encamped outside, the Japanese Army's 44th Regiment, known as the Kochi Regiment, was gradually being worn down, as their repeated attempts to storm the stronghold had all failed. During their time at Luodian, the regiment had made numerous unsuccessful attempts to seize the villa. Limited artillery support hampered their efforts. Logistical challenges meant each artillery piece received only 1/5 of its normal daily ammunition supply. On September the 19th, engineers began digging a tunnel from the trenches towards the White House. 4 days later, they had excavated exactly 35 yards, effectively halving the distance the infantry would need to cross the exposed ground before reaching the villa's defenses. A new attack was launched on the 23rd, beginning with an artillery bombardment, followed by air raids. Next, tanks advanced towards the walls with small clusters of soldiers trailing behind. This attack included a surprise element for the Chinese defenders. As the offensive unfolded, a tunnel's entrance erupted open, allowing soldiers to emerge in single file close to the wall, too quickly for the Chinese machine gunners to adjust their aim. The soldiers rushed forward, bearing heavy satchels of explosives. Pressing against the wall, they ignited the fuses and sought cover as the loud explosions rang out. When the dust settled, the Japanese surged through the new openings in the walls, spreading out within the compound. After a fierce battle lasting 2.5 hours, the building was captured by the Japanese troops. Despite losing the White House, Lin Yingdong, the commander of the 1st Battalion, was awarded an A2 grade Medal of the Armed Forces. He was also promoted to lieutenant colonel and appointed as the regimental attaché of the 66th Regiment for successfully defending the White House against a numerically superior enemy for nearly a month. The capture of the White House was part of a significant offensive launched by the 11th Division in the Luodian area. Initially scheduled for September the 20th, the operation faced delays of several days due to prolonged preparations, a common issue in the challenging countryside surrounding Shanghai. The division chose to attack south of the town with a narrow front to concentrate enough forces to deliver a powerful, unified strike against the Chinese positions. The Japanese employed massed armor in their assault, deployed aircraft to neutralize any anti-tank weapons that would emerge. These tactics proved highly effective, as the Chinese were pushed back in multiple sections of the front. To marshal sufficient troops for the attack, the division assigned to the Shigeto detachment to cover its right flank north and west of Luodian. However, the newly arrived detachment, full of morale, exceeded its mandate by launching a vigorous counterattack against the Chinese in its sector. Unfortunately, their efforts yielded little significant progress as they suffered heavy casualties. As Matsue would report, "The detachment has already had 200 casualties. They can't keep attacking blindly like this." Further south, the 3rd Japanese Division also mounted attacks against Chinese forces, primarily around Luohang. The fighting revealed Japan's material superiority, which was so pronounced that the Chinese refrained from deploying heavy artillery even when available. Anti-aircraft guns were strategically positioned near artillery batteries, but the Chinese were reluctant to use them for fear of revealing their locations. Consequently, the Chinese army found itself with virtually no air defense at all. Overall, local Chinese reserves struggled to repel the Japanese advances, leading to a shift from seesaw battles that had characterized the front since early September. The Japanese gradually maintained their positions even after nightfall. Despite their numerical superiority, defending Luodian proved nearly impossible for the Chinese forces. The Japanese' overwhelming firepower forced the Chinese into a defensive posture, preventing them from launching counterattacks until the enemy was almost upon them. Consequently, the decision was made to hold the entire town at all cost, a tactic that significantly increased the attritional rate within the Chinese ranks. General Chen Chang's army group experienced a casualty rate exceeding 50%, resulting in more than 15,000 losses. Additionally, units from Shi Yue's 19th Army Group participated in the combat southwest of Luodian and suffered severe casualties as well. The 59th and 90th Divisions of the 4th Corps endured 70 to 80% losses within just 5 days. The training brigade of the 66th Corps reported 3,003 casualties after several days of fighting. Faced with these circumstances, Chinese commanders decided to execute another major retreat along the entire front north of Shanghai. They took advantage of the lull in Japanese assaults on September the 25th to withdraw approximately 1 mile to a new defensive line. As before, this retreat was conducted with great discipline, and it took the Japanese 2 more days to fully comprehend that the Chinese forces had disappeared from their positions. Now, in the wake of these Japanese successes, significant changes began to unfold. The 3 divisions that the Japanese High Command had dispatched to Shanghai's area in early September gradually arrived. First to land was the 101st Division, which started disembarking on September the 22nd and was ordered to position itself on the left flank of the 3rd Division. The 9th Division arrived in the same area on September the 27th, followed by the 13th Division October the 1st. With these reinforcements, Japan now had 5 divisions stationed in Shanghai, compared to more than 25 divisions fielded by the Chinese. While China's numerical superiority was undeniable, the disparity was not as stark as it appeared. A typical Japanese division consisted of 15,000 men. Combined with the Marines and infantry defending Hangzhou, Japan had approximately 90,000 soldiers at its disposal in and around the city. In contrast, Chinese divisions often had as few as 5,000 men, making it unlikely that China deployed more than 200,000 soldiers in Shanghai at any given time. Furthermore, the Japanese compensated for their numerical disadvantage with significant superiority materials, aircraft, and naval artillery, which could still reach key areas within the Chinese front. Overall, the addition of these 3 new divisions significantly bolstered the Japanese forces, prompting Matsue and his staff to begin preparations for what they hoped would be the decisive strike against the Chinese defenders. Their plan was straightforward. They intended to execute a powerful thrust across Wusong Creek and advance straight towards Suzhou Creek. The goal was to encircle and annihilate the main Chinese force in the maneuver that they had envisioned since their arrival in China. After all, encirclement was the cornerstone of Japanese military doctrine. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a kind of silly episode looking at how Japanese anime today depicts the Pacific War. To be honest, it's actually looks like it's going viral. So if you already went to go check it out, please leave a comment saying you came from the Fallen Riser Channel podcast. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In August of 1937, the Battle of Luodian raged as Chinese forces faced relentless Japanese attacks. After initial successes, the Chinese struggled under heavy casualties and dwindling morale. They fought fiercely to retain the critical town of Luodian, a vital transportation hub. Despite courageous defensive efforts, including a surprise night assault, the Japanese overwhelmed the Chinese with superior numbers and artillery. Encounters turned devastating, with both sides suffering heavy losses. By late September, the Japanese received reinforcements. The situation forced the Chinese to retreat, marking the beginning of a dire struggle for Shanghai's control.